Good morning. I'm Julie Ty. I'm president of the New York League of Conservation Voters, and I want to welcome you all to our forum on understanding the CLCPA scoping plan and action steps. We thank you for joining us today. We are happy to be joined with our partner in this event, Sustainable Westchester, who we partner with on many educational forums through a variety of different topics. The New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund's mission is to educate, engage, and empower New Yorkers to be effective advocates for the environment. And this forum is part of a series that we've been holding on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act over the last 3 years now. We, through these series, have been trying to create a goal of diving deeper into how we're going to achieve the ambitious climate goals that the state of New York has set in a way that is effective, efficient, and equitable. We also want to build public awareness, educate New Yorkers on climate policy, and help provide support and recommendations for how we can meet those objectives. So today we'll be looking a little bit more specifically about what's in the scoping plan and diving into more of the topics as much as one can do in 2 hours. So we're grateful to have you there. And so thank you again for joining us. And I would like to hand this over now to my partner, Nina Orville from Sustainable Westchester.
Thank you so much, Julie, and to the League of Conservation Voters for partnering with Sustainable Westchester on this event. Thanks to our wonderful presenters who are climate leaders in New York State and beyond. And I want to thank Maria Genovese at Sustainable Westchester for helping to spearhead the organization of this event. And finally, we're so grateful to all of you in attendance for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I'm Nina Orville. I'm the executive director of Sustainable Westchester. And for those of you who might not know, Sustainable Westchester is a nonprofit organization whose members are 45 municipalities here in Westchester County. We run leading programs that accelerate the transition to clean energy and a more sustainable environment while maximizing economic and community benefits and redressing environmental justice harms. We view our role as helping to ensure that the goals and requirements of New York State's Climate Act, including the focus on investment in so-called disadvantaged communities, are achieved here in Westchester. Our municipal members are leaders in New York in many respects, and we're so pleased that the association that represents them, the Westchester Municipal Officials Association, just adopted a resolution in support of the Climate Action Council scoping plan at Sustainable Westchester's urging, and with the drafting by wonderful Jen Metzger, who's one of our presenters today. As you'll hear, it's critical that we take action during the public comment period in support of the adoption of the scoping plan. And I'm going to briefly share with you the agenda for this presentation. Do you have that, Maria?
I don't. I'm sorry. I had sent that last night.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's fine. So we're going to be starting with Raya Salter, who's here with us today. Raya is an energy and climate justice attorney and the founder of the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. She's an appointed member of the New York State Climate Action Council, the one appointed member from Westchester County, in fact. And she's going to introduce the Climate Action Council and the scoping plan process, as well as providing perspective on the critical issues of environmental justice and just transition within the context of the plan. So we're going to start with Raya, and then we're going to move through a number of other sectors, including buildings and electricity and transportation and land use and waste. And then we'll finish with some questions and follow-up actions and support that we'll be providing to you to help you make comments as part of the commenting process. So Raya.
Hi, thank you so much, Nina. Hello, everybody. So hello, welcome. Thanks to everyone for joining this conversation during your lunchtime. From my perspective, nothing is more important than folks getting engaged so that this can be the people's plan. So I want to commend folks for your passion, your interest, your curiosity, and let's go ahead and talk a bit about our scoping plan. All right, an overview of our draft scoping plan and the process behind it. All right, so I've already been introduced, but just a few words about me. Yes, I am a climate and energy justice attorney. I have newly founded an organization called the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center, the nation's first public interest law firm focused on energy justice. My background is very much working in New York State and other places as a regulatory attorney, clean energy and energy justice advocate for environmental organizations. Most recently, the New York Renews Coalition, which is famous for helping to power forward with folks on this call and many others, our 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So just mentioning that. Onwards. So there's a lot going on, and our Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act really is one of the country's most ambitious climate laws, and by far the law that has the most substantive pieces on climate and environmental justice. We have some incredibly ambitious targets. We're talking about zero emissions electricity by 2040. You know, that is not far from now, and economy-wide net zero by 2050. So this is a really a major step that New York has taken towards getting us where we need to be, where the science and the IPCC says we need to be heading if we're going to avert the worst of the climate crisis. And of course, with that brings very ambitious goals for renewable energy, energy storage, energy efficiency, and other items. So talk about those targets, but what does that target actually look like? And we'll take a bit of time here. I know this is a crowded slide. If you're having your sandwich and you don't have your glasses on, you might need your glasses for this particular slide. But the big picture that I want you to see is that this pie is looking at GHG emissions by sector, because this is a big, ambitious climate goal and plan. And so you can see the big yellow slice, the bright yellow slice, that is the emissions that are coming from our buildings. Look at how many emissions are coming from our buildings and how much we need to do to really focus on that sector. Then this dark blue slice, look how much is really focused on our transportation sector. And then you see the green one and the orange one, you know, electricity, waste, other, etc. And so, and then on the right, sort of what these goals mean. So this is sort of just wanted to give folks an overview of what these actual emissions reduction targets look like by sector and where these emissions are coming from. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what the CLCPA says. I just referenced that we have these really robust climate environmental justice provisions. So what does the CLCPA say about that? And it's really quite remarkable, and we need to continue to work to make sure that these pieces are implemented. So environmental justice, when we're talking about environmental justice, we're talking about an equitable distribution of environmental benefits and harms. We're talking about equal protection and enforcement of environmental laws. And we're talking about looking at that from from how those impacts happened over time, cumulative impacts. And so if we're going to change the trajectory of harm that energy systems have caused environmental justice frontline communities, we need to have what we call guardrails, environmental justice guardrails for our new investment and our new development. And so this is what you see in the CLCPA. State contracts must not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. So that means that as the state is looking to do their development, their environmental work, they have to develop an analysis to see who is already burdened, be it by race or other factor, and how do we make sure that we do not further burden those communities, because our goal is to alleviate environmental injustice. What's another key environmental justice piece, that emissions and co-pollutants, the reductions that we want to see, these overall emissions reductions I just talked about, they must be prioritized in quote unquote disadvantaged communities. It's not enough to try and reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions unless we're looking at the justice components. And that's what our law in New York State says. There are a lot of things, but additional pieces that are in the CLCPA, but the one more of it I'm going to really focus on is our so-called, our 40%, our climate justice mandate. This idea that a goal of 40% and no less than 35% of the state's climate spending must be directed to quote unquote disadvantaged communities. We need to start investing our climate spending in those who need it the most. If anyone has heard of the Biden administration's Justice 40 Environmental Justice Initiative, it came from New York. That's where it came from. So state climate action really does matter. So I want folks to understand that we've got a process here of really wanting to do this change, but do it in a way that does not create additional environmental injustice, that actually seeks to alleviate environmental and climate justice concerns first and invest in a just transition for all of New Yorkers. And when we talk about disadvantaged communities, which we'll talk a bit more about later in terms of that designation, we're not talking about a small minority. We're talking about up to 40% or more of New York State's population. All right, so how does the law prescribe for all of this to happen? And this is all happening pursuant to the statute itself. And what the law says is that there will be a climate action council that will develop the scoping plan. And then also there's a climate justice working group that is tasked with advising the council and developing that disadvantaged communities criteria. The Climate Justice Working Group is made up of climate environmental justice advocates from throughout the state. So this is a really unique aspect, another idea of participatory justice. How are communities and advocates involved in the actual policy making? And that was prescribed by the CLCPA. Why do I tell you all of this? Because both the New York State Climate Scoping Plan, which we're going to talk about further today, and that disadvantaged communities criteria, they are both out right now for public comment. So there is a lot going on. It's a lot to take in, but I wanted to give folks an overview of the process and where we are. So back to the idea of what's going on with this plan itself. Trust me, I understand. It is more than 300 pages. It is complicated and it is full of analyses, and there's a lot of things to like and there's some things not to like. And as a member of the Climate Action Council from Westchester, I have certainly been, from my perspective, working very focused to advocate how can I make it push the plan to be as progressive as possible, to work as much as possible for women, youth, children, and families, and the transition we want to see from a climate justice perspective. Consider the source. That's the source you're going to get from me, Ms. Raya. Also, Climate Auntie on Instagram. If you're on Instagram, follow me. I am Climate Auntie, and feel free to consider me your climate family. So the key thing, I think, to help understanding the scoping plan from a broad perspective is that it's not just one plan. It's actually offering 3 different scenarios. And so I get there's a lot going on, but it's offering up different scenarios. And here you can see, again, apologies, you need your glasses a little bit. There are scenarios that each scenario uses a different level of various, types of technologies to get us to where we need to get. And that's what this graph is showing. On the left, say, if you're looking at the bottom, carbon sequestration in lands and forest, how much does scenario 2 rely on this? Quite a bit. How much does scenario 3 rely on this? Much, much more, as does scenario 4. So that is the context that you're seeing this plan, and it kind of adds a level of complexity. And so you'll see, when you look at the plan, you'll see these 3 pillars often, because these analyses are being done for each of these scenarios. I get it, it's complicated. But there's some really good news about the plan. And this is, I want to take some time to look at this slide in terms of the cost benefit analysis. Look, we all knew it was going to be true. And guess what it is? The cost of action so far underway, the benefits of action far outweigh the cost of inaction. We're looking at between 90 and $120 billion of benefits if we act compared to if we do not. And so if you look at the scenarios, and I will say and I'll talk about it a bit later, but several council members, including myself, and the Climate Justice Working Group support scenario 3. Now, this is accelerated transition away from combustion. Why do we support that? Because it makes the most use of clean and renewable energy and the least use of combustion, because from our perspective, we need to get away from combustion engines. But looking at scenario 3, for example, you can see that the benefits that you see, this avoided GHG benefits, and a lot of that is health. And then, avoided GHG benefits and then health. So you can see for scenario 3, we're looking at $120 billion in net benefits. And you're seeing how much of that is from the health benefits from getting away from fossil fuels, and how much of that is the benefits from avoiding greenhouse gas reduction. So there's really a lot of good news in the plan for what we can do if we make the investments we need in clean, renewable energy, and reducing our carbon statewide. So shifting back again to this piece about the disadvantaged communities. So I mentioned that this designation has been created by climate justice experts, and the draft of this has also been released. And what I want folks to see, for our Westchester folks to see, it's a little hard. There's a map, and I encourage folks to go to it, and you can put in by zip code. But these sort of gray splotches, this is disadvantaged communities designations according to the DEC's draft criteria and map. And what you see is a very heavy concentration of quote unquote disadvantaged communities in Westchester County. In fact, we have the highest concentration of disadvantaged communities outside of New York City in the entire state. And what does this mean? If you go back to what I was saying about this climate justice mandate, this investment, this 35 to 40% investment, we are, and I don't like war analogies, but we are ground zero in Westchester County, in theory, for these climate investments. And what that can mean for our particular, not only our cities, but in particular, our cities and municipalities could really be game changing. And so it's important to keep your eye on what the impacts ultimately will be. I was doing a time check. I want to finish up on this plan. So again, myself, the Climate Justice Working Group in particular, and other council members support scenario 3, moving away from combustion and false solutions. And that's a whole nother conversation about the natural gas, the fossil gas industry, and the way they want to maintain their infrastructure by doing experimental fuel blending so that ultimately they can maintain their infrastructure. It's a very serious issue and problem. So folks support scenario 3. I said, consider the source, moving away from combustion and false solutions. Please register. The CAC hearings, the scoping plan hearings have just ended, the public hearings, although you can still provide written comment. The Climate Justice Working Group hearings are still happening. There is one happening in June 10th in Mount Vernon. Please attend the June 10th meeting. You can contact me directly on Instagram if you like, Climate Auntie, and come with me. But please, we want to do comments for this. Something else I want to really mention is there is a statewide misinformation campaign, and that you need to know that there are folks on the council that represent fossil fuel industry. There is a well-funded and organized campaign to sow fear about the plan, about its costs, that are really myths and misrepresentations. So I really want folks to be on the lookout for those. And that is everything. I hope you had your seatbelts on. It's a whirlwind tour, but that is the nutshell as best I can do it. And please don't hesitate to reach out to me on Instagram is a good way.
Thank you,
Thank you
Raya.
so much, Raya. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about buildings and the gas transition. So we're so pleased to have Jen Metzger, an energy policy expert and former state senator, and wonderful colleague here with us today, as well as Jared Rodriguez, a decarbonization expert and principal of Emergent Urban Solutions, who is behind some of the most interesting work that's happening related to decarbonizing buildings. So we're so glad they're going to cover this for us. And I believe Jen is going to start.
Great. Thank you, Nina. I'm just going to share my screen. And great overview too by Raya. So I'm going to start us off with an overview of the building sector and issues. I'm going to start with this pie chart, which is, basically same information, but different version of what Raya showed you. But I wanted to just highlight, how big a share of New York's emissions are from our buildings. Nearly a third of the state's emissions are from our buildings. This is the most up-to-date emissions data from the greenhouse gas emissions inventory published by the DEC in 2021. And I just want to point out that in earlier greenhouse gas emissions inventories for New York, transportation was the leading source of emissions. And now buildings and transportation have switched places. And this is because the way we account for those emissions is now more comprehensive and better reflects the true impact of our reliance on fossil gas. The 2019 Climate Act requires that we consider upstream emissions of the fossil fuels we're burning, including emissions from where it's extracted outside of New York. The inventory also uses a 20-year global warming potential to better account for the impact of methane emissions. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because our building sector relies to a great degree on fossil gas, and the industry continues to market it as clean, which it obviously is not. And Raya has already talked about the campaigns underway. But it's important to be armed with the correct information. The vast majority of emissions from our buildings is from on-site combustion of fossil fuels. As shown by the bar on the left, the residential sector accounts for the large share of emissions. That's the light blue on the bar. The middle bar shows the breakdown by fuel type. And as indicated by the green, most buildings in New York use utility gas. Under 20% of buildings use fuel oil, and the remaining buildings use propane, wood, or electric heating. The bar on the far right shows the space heating accounts for around 2/3 of direct emissions. That's the gray, yellow, and orange representing single family, multifamily, and commercial space heating respectively. And that's followed by hot water, which is the lighter green, and then other uses like cooking and other appliances. But by far, space heating is the largest source of emissions. So eliminating these emissions from our buildings is going to require transformative changes. According to the findings of the integration analysis that Raya had talked about, the analysis looking at different scenarios, there were some, we had these different scenarios, but there were some common findings across them. We need to electrify 1 to 2 million homes with energy efficient heat pumps by 2030 to reach our emissions reduction targets. And by 2050, most of New York's over 6.2 million buildings will need to make that switch to efficient, electric heating and cooling solutions, heat pumps, air source or ground source, powered by a zero emissions grid. Meeting the necessary undertaking the necessary changes to our buildings it can be done. It's technically feasible, but we have challenges that we have to address. New York's building stock is very old. About 3/4 of our buildings were constructed before there were any energy codes. I live in a house that's 140 years old, and that's pretty common in my neck of the woods. Even if we electrify and eliminate fossil fuels, we still need to tighten the building envelope to keep energy costs down and to right-size heat pump systems. And many old buildings also have other problems. They need to be fixed, that need to be fixed before the building envelope is tightened. You know, these are things like mold issues and leaky roofs. And by the way, the picture on that picture of that house on this slide that's in rather poor condition, a lot of houses in my old Senate district in rural New York are in this kind of shape. This is very real, a very real challenge, which brings me to my next point. Nearly half of New York's households are low and moderate income, and they're going to need additional assistance to make the necessary improvements to their homes. NYSERDA has estimated that it will require at least $1 billion annually. Just to put it in perspective, current spending, state spending, utility spending is around 1/4 of that. And it's absolutely critical that the transition from utility gas to electricity-based technologies is carefully managed and does not increase the burden on low and moderate income households. Heat pumps are much more efficient than fossil systems, but electricity prices have tended to be higher than gas prices. So new utility design, rate designs are going to be needed. And another issue is that, you know, renters pay their electricity bills, but often do not pay their heating bills, which is part of their rent. So, you know, as we're making that shift to electrification, we have to make sure that renters are protected. There are, without a doubt, big challenges to decarbonizing our buildings, but there are also tremendous benefits, in addition to the benefits of reducing climate damaging emissions. The combustion of fossil fuels, as Raya talked about, you know, it produces other harmful emissions that cause numerous health-related problems. As the scoping plan states, air quality improvements from meeting our climate goals can avoid tens of thousands of premature deaths, thousands of non-fatal heart attacks, thousands of other hospitalizations, thousands of asthma-related emergency room visits, and hundreds of thousands of lost workdays. The integration analysis estimates that public health savings alone are on the range of $50 to $120 billion by 2050, and that's from economy-wide decarbonization. The number of jobs that decarbonizing our buildings will create is truly mind-blowing and unprecedented. It's estimated to create a net gain of 140,000 jobs by 2030, and that's just in the building-related professions. The net costs of the clean energy transition are projected to be a fairly small percentage of gross state product. And that's in good part because the equipment and goods that rely on fossil fuels are going to be replaced at the end of their useful life. This is not to say that there will not be upfront costs, because there will be, and policies have to be put in place and designed to mitigate those costs and encourage people to make the right choices. So I'm going to end there with that overview and turn it over to my partner, Jared.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, switching to me. All right. Okay, here we go. So for the period 2030 to 2050, there's going to be a major switch in focus from new build, right, regulating new construction, over to an existing buildings focus. And some of that existing building focus is going to start phasing in prior to 2030. So regulations to govern climate impacts from existing buildings include regulating GHG emissions and imposing energy efficiency standards, and also standards on what equipment will be available for purchase in New York State. So there was a mention of replacing equipment at the end of its useful life. At some point, right, when a domestic hot water heater in a home is ready for replacement, you know, a homeowner will not have access to a fossil-fired domestic hot water heater, or that's the hope if we're going to pursue scenario 3, as discussed earlier. Benchmarking rules, embodied carbon and reporting disclosures for buildings. Embodied carbon is the emissions associated with construction. Emissions benchmarking, I mean, we've seen local laws in New York City roll out. New York City is the leader in New York State, and I expect additional municipalities and other, you know, county level governments, et cetera, to start, you know, following that path. Obviously, incentives, there will be a priority for disadvantaged communities. We heard a bit about that earlier. And then ultimately, we may see emissions related fines, fees, or taxes associated with GHGs coming from buildings. Additionally, right, there needs to be a phase out of high global warming potential refrigerants. Refrigerants, when they leak, can cause serious climate harm. So focusing on utility transition, there was discussion around the idea of blending in low or zero emissions fuels, which is a sort of a talking point coming from the fossil gas industry. If we're going to pursue scenario 3, we need to be phasing out combustion of methane, of gas. You know, additionally, we need to be disclosing and reporting on fugitive methane emissions coming from gas infrastructure, since methane has serious global warming potential, much larger than carbon dioxide itself. And we need to be thinking about phasing out of gas infrastructure on a block by block or city by city basis. There's an opportunity for utilities to own, operate, and manage thermal energy networks or lower zero carbon heating networks that would then allow homeowners or building owners to tap into zero emissions thermal distribution or community thermal energy networks. And there needs to be an alignment of gas phase out objectives with electric infrastructure and thermal energy network infrastructure upgrades and planning. Planning for this transition is really important. So municipal action and Westchester County implications, municipalities need to be thinking about their comprehensive plan and aligning that with the objectives of the CLCPA. The comprehensive plan is what governs local action from a municipal perspective, including zoning and codes. Municipalities can adopt the stretch code to drive efficiency in buildings, and as buildings are renovated, you know, driving performance. Municipal and water companies can actually develop today without any regulatory approval. They can develop frameworks for third-party access to sanitary sewer heat extraction or rejection. That's could be seen as an existing thermal network that already is in most of our communities. And then municipal or county ownership and development of thermal energy networks is possible as well. So government should be, local, county, et cetera, they should be also setting deadlines, you know, locally for buildings within their portfolios to meet decarbonization goals ahead of those CLCPA requirements. That is a recommendation that I am making because I believe government should lead. And so some of the blind spots or misconceptions that are out there, I'm sure a number of folks are hearing about this, are that we could just do a one-to-one equipment swap out from existing fossil gas-fired equipment to heat pumps, for example. That is not advisable, right? We need to be fostering efficiency, tightening up building envelopes, at the same time that we're considering electrification. So there's a holistic approach to decarbonizing buildings. We need to make buildings efficient, and we need to electrify and move away from combustion. There's an approach that we're calling resource efficient decarbonization. I'll get into that shortly. And then this idea that we could just sit around and wait for better technology to come along, it's not advisable. We have technology available to us, commercially available to us today, that we should be moving in the direction of adopting. And sure, as new technology comes along, it can be plugged into existing buildings. So what is resource efficient decarbonization? It's an incremental methodology and an integrated design process that's then combined with strategic capital planning that can create a path or paths toward efficient carbon neutral buildings over time. And so it includes a few of these objectives. This is sort of like a design perspective. So how would an engineer go about decarbonizing a building? Well, they put a few objectives in place, like requiring limited or no combustion, enabling carbon neutrality, pursue designs that are highly efficient at very low design temperatures and during extreme weather, buildings that are highly resilient or demand conscious or energy grid interactive, reducing thermal waste by capturing as many on-site or nearby thermal flows as possible. We talked about tightening up building facades. So trying to eliminate waste through the facade or through windows, for example, capturing heat that's being lost maybe through ventilation or even through the sewer, right? We're just dumping hot water down the sewer. And then incorporating realistic or flexible implementation strategies by then optimizing and scheduling phase-in of low carbon retrofits. And so this is it as a visual heuristic, starting by reviewing where, when, and how fossil gas is being consumed. Sorry about that. I have a timer set. Where and how fossil gas is being consumed in the building, reducing consumption of gas by increasing performance and efficiency, recovering waste heat wherever possible, and then beginning the process of replacing a heating capacity or gas-fired heating capacity with electric solutions. And then here's a fairly complex image showing the opportunities in large buildings. I generally focus on large buildings, and there's a major opportunity to network the sharing of heat in large existing buildings, across buildings, throughout buildings, and between buildings, and that's that thermal energy network that I mentioned. And so if folks are interested in getting more resources from NYSERDA, I represent NYSERDA. I advise them on the Empire Building Challenge, for example. You could scan that QR code, go to the knowledge base as part of the Empire Building Challenge and learn more about some of the information that I just presented. And then there's additionally a number of other NYSERDA resources and programs that are out there that folks should check out. Thanks.
Great. Okay, Jared, if you could stop sharing.
Sure.
Great. And now we're going to switch gears again to talk about electricity. I'm going to start this conversation and then I'll turn it over to Leo Wigman, who is the Director of Solar Programs here at Sustainable Westchester and an energy expert way beyond that capacity as well. So a few, just to lay the groundwork regarding electricity and what the Climate Act requires. It requires that 70% of electricity come from renewable energy sources by 2030. And to put it in context, in 2020, that number was 27%. So we're looking for a huge change very quickly in that respect. Also, 6 gigawatts of solar by 2025. We currently have 3.6 that are constructed. So there's a lot of additional solar development that is coming and underway. And that target of 6 gigawatts was increased to 10 gigawatts by 2030. So there's a longer term plan that is being developed as well. In addition, energy storage, which has not been given as much attention as it must in order for us to achieve our goals. There are ambitious goals in that respect as well. And that by 2040, the state achieve a zero emissions electricity system. And that's going to rely on offshore wind as well. In addition, it requires further procurement of renewables, as we were discussing, deploying existing technology and developing new technologies as well, support for the clean energy standard and storage deployment, transmission upgrades, refined electric grid modeling to improve decision-making and improve coordination across all state agencies, and market solutions that better align with the 100% emissions-free requirement in order to accelerate that transition from fossil fuel generation while maintaining reliability and affordability. Other considerations include prioritizing workforce development with a focus on economic growth and job growth impacts, recognizing the importance of the current workforce structure that we have and providing for a just transition as well for those whose careers will be changing through the process of this transition. As well, focusing on fiscally responsible transition and development costs, sharing benefits, recognizing and prioritizing the need to guard against unfair burden in disadvantaged communities. This is something that Jen touched on in terms of the question, for instance, the specific issue of who pays for heat, and setting strict guidelines for ensuring environmental justice. With all of these topics, the solutions that are being proposed intersect. So in the case of electricity, as transportation and the building sectors transition to electric, there will be increased demand, of course, for electricity, and that has to be met through renewable generation. The state anticipates that electricity demand will grow 65 to 80% by 2050. Depending on some of the details of how electrification takes place. And efficiency is really critical to managing the growth in demand for electricity. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Leo, who is going to talk about recommendations. Leo?
The level of electrification needed to achieve these greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements will increase, as Nita just mentioned, the overall electric load, and interestingly enough, will shift the system peak from its current midday summer to a winter morning because of the prevalence of the future air source heat pumps kicking on a January morning. Given the large amounts of renewables that must be procured and developed to reach the goals, the state does need to incorporate flexibility in load and controllability into the electric grid as the different sectors, transportation, buildings, et cetera, electrify to meet and create a more manageable system. The new and upgraded transmission and distribution systems will also be necessary to deliver energy from where generation is located, both upstate and offshore, to where the load demand and peaks will exist, principally downstate. Finally, the recommendations include advancing long duration storage and designing market mechanisms that promote and support and do not disadvantage clean resources that are needed to meet the requirements. Thank you. So when we take the short view to 2030, only 8 years away, the recommendations include the retirement of the fossil fuel-fired facilities that are aligned with the emission reduction targets. The state has done a good job in closing out coal plants from here, but it has to move beyond that. We need to accelerate growth of large-scale renewable generation. We need to facilitate the distributed generation of those clean energy sources and around the state. And we need to support clean energy siting and the community acceptance of these large-scale renewable energy projects. And in addition, we need to promote local community choice aggregation at the municipal level for giving local control over choices of supply. And finally, we need to deploy existing storage technologies that are on the shelf now. Looking further down the road toward 2050, the state and us collectively, we all need to invest in transmission and distribution infrastructure upgrades throughout the entire network. We need to improve the reliability planning and markets as these changes come at us. And we need to advance the demand side solutions to manage the uptick in demand. And finally, we need to explore and support technologies that advance and provide innovative solutions. Statewide, the implications include a further emphasis on the equitable phasing out of fossil fuel power generation by 2040, and include the early retirement of the peaker gas-fired plants, principally located in disadvantaged communities. In addition, the state needs increased investment in energy storage and scaling the deployment of resources to achieve the goals in areas where there are current shortfalls as necessary. For example, the advancement of battery energy storage technology specifically. The state probably needs to take a technology neutral stance toward generation sources other than wind and solar and hydropower that may be necessary for grid reliability in 2040 and beyond. And finally, there's a focus on minimizing the greenhouse gas and co-pollutant emissions that Jen and others have mentioned, that are viable dispatchable resources with an eye toward continuously emerging technologies. So within Westchester, the implications can be viewed as follows: that we need to channel the large-scale benefits of this clean energy transition to the disadvantaged communities that we've mentioned before are so prevalent in Westchester County. We need to build and expand on community engagement and public education to familiarize communities with the renewable energy options and the information around that. We need solutions that provide robust host and subscriber benefits for solar with support for the siting of these and incentives. We need support and funding for the innovative programs that take advantage of the dynamic rate structures forthcoming and the community choice aggregation or shared community storage options that will be expanding going forward. Local municipal support also needs to be collected and across the intersecting solutions, from streamlining permitting to local ordinances that enable clean energy infrastructure and the local laws and approval processes for those projects. Further, there needs to be regional and county association support for municipalities.
Leo, can I interrupt for 1 second? It's really hard to hear you. There seems to be a lot of background noise or something.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had to switch.
Oh, that's tremendously better.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'll just speak closer to the microphone. I had to switch to another computer this morning. So we need to also advocate for easier to meet thresholds for the inclusion of solutions and interconnectedness, including building energy, transportation, and waste as a combined set of solutions. And we need to create a standardized sort of replicable model for solar plus storage projects located on the same sites. Next, please. Going forward, the path includes continued expansion and building of increased momentum for community choice aggregation, such as Westchester Power Sustainable Westchester's Community Choice Program. We need to develop and implement community distributed generation of these clean energy resources to include issues of climate justice and to properly interact with state and regional policymakers about these facilities. We need to innovate around renewable source technology, including the adoption of renewable energy sources by municipal governments. And we need to create standardized replicable model for communities solar plus storage projects with an emphasis on existing storage technology and being open to the advanced and promising technologies. And further, we need to advocate for large-scale storage solutions to mitigate reliability concerns in the grid. Additionally, there needs to be a prioritization of renewable energy benefits for disadvantaged communities and low-income individuals and households. We need to eliminate the need for the use of peaker plants, gas-fired peaker plants, with reliable technology solutions and grid efficiency programs. And there needs to be intersecting solutions that focus on a combination of things, such as building electrification, decommissioning of the bulk storage fuel sites that are often located next to mid-rise apartment buildings, the envelope tightening for buildings for efficiency, and the demand management solutions for load management, and then the solar plus storage and installation. We also need to be cognizant and supportive of workforce development to bring low to moderate income individuals and those from disadvantaged communities into the green workforce that will be expanding as we go forward. We need to promote as best we can, community ownership of these storage, solar, and wind facilities going forward, and promote electrification projects that guaranteed savings for residents and small businesses and don't put an undue burden on the low to moderate income buildings and their residents. Thank you. And I believe we're a few minutes over. I apologize.
Great, thank you, Leo. So we are now going to be turning this over to Julie and the transportation sector.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna share my screen and get my slideshow going. So transportation is a really big piece of the pie. I mean, we heard a lot about buildings, and that as the way New York State attributes it is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. The way the rest of the world translated, transportation would be the biggest source. Any way you look at it, transportation is a really huge piece of the pie that we need to be dealing with. And that's what we're going to focus on for the next few minutes. The New York League of Conservation Voters, the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund are very active in the transportation space. We're founders of several coalitions, including the Clean Fuels New York Coalition. It's advocating for a clean fuel standard, and a New York City and New York State Clean School Bus Coalition that's been advocating for electrification of school buses. So really, this is something that the League has been working on for many years at both the state and city level. We've seen this on several slides. It's really just to emphasize again, as Ryan noted at the very beginning, right? We have big chunks of things we need to deal with for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And a huge chunk of that comes from the transportation sector, 28%. The biggest chunk of that actually comes from passenger vehicles. There's more air pollution, and it's more harmful from a public health perspective on diesel trucks, diesel vehicles, but there are many, many more greenhouse gas emissions that come from passenger vehicles, and that's mostly based on volume because we have upwards of 9 million registered passenger vehicles in the state of New York right now. And unlike in the energy sector, right, when we're dealing with the energy sector, by and large, you're dealing with an industry that's regulated and that's managed, and they're used to being regulated. With the transportation sector, it's really much more about how do people change what they are doing? I mean, there's a certain component of it that's directed at industry, but we can't just drive our way out of the climate crisis. And that involves people changing behavior. And as you all know, as New Yorkers, people don't like being told what to do. So it requires some more ways of different thinking about things along those lines. Looking at what we would need to do to meet the requirements of transformation required by the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, we would need to have 3 million zero emission light duty vehicles in use by 2030 and 10 million zero emission light duty vehicles in use by 2050. We need to have enhanced availability, accessibility, reliability, and affordability of public transportation services, with really an emphasis on underserved and unserved communities right now. Some of the things that we're looking at is really getting much more use of mass transit, of buses in particular, to get more people to and from, including what they call is microtransit. So that is something that we'll be looking at. This is some of the things we need to do to reach a 40% reduction by 2030, which is just not that far from now. We need to be looking at, and I'm sure Karen will talk about this more, but we need to be reimagining how we're building our development. We need to have more mobility or transit-oriented development to encourage people to live, to work, to play in the places that they live, so that they're not having to travel as far and reliant on those various sources of motor vehicles that currently rely on fossil fuels. So the recommendations of some of the strategies, expect that by 2030, you would have nearly all of our light duty vehicles being sold as zero emissions. 40% of our medium and heavy duty vehicles to be zero emissions, and increasing the use of public transportation, in particular in urban areas. Outside of New York City, the goal would be to actually double the amount of mass transit that you're using. Inside of New York City, it would be a growth, but not quite double, since there's so much mass transit already in use right now. We know that some of these things can be accomplished with a variety of different tools that are available. We have a law that requires zero emission vehicle sales for both light duty vehicles and medium heavy duty vehicle sales, but we are restricted by federal law to doing either what EPA does or what California does. And so right now we are requiring only zero emission vehicle sales starting in 2035, and for medium and heavy duty vehicles is 2045. So that's going to be a challenge for how we accomplish this goal of meeting this 40% reduction and getting 100% light duty sales when we don't have all of those vehicles out there now. And to give you some perspective on that, so of the roughly 9 million vehicles that we have on the road for passenger vehicles, 45,000 of them are electric vehicles right now. So we have a long way to go to reach those goals. And we need to make sure that we're actively moving to get more people educated about electric vehicles and how easy and convenient they can be. We need to be, again, investing in much more expanded public transportation and micromobility. In order to support micromobility, we need enhanced bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. This is really, a few years ago, we passed a law that enabled public e-bikes and e-scooters to be utilized, and local governments have the authority to allow e-scooters to be used on their streetscapes. And those are things that can get people out of cars, because as I said at the beginning, you can't drive your way out of the climate crisis, unfortunately. We know we need to incorporate market-based programs in order for us to provide incentives for the business community and for people to make these changes, because there's only so many government subsidies that are going to be available based on the amount of money we need to be spending on a variety of different things, and supporting low carbon transportation choices. We want to make sure that we're moving forward with the clean fuel standard, because as we know, there's millions of vehicles that are going to be on the road for more than the next 2 decades that are reliant on fuels. And we want to make sure that we're moving off of fossil fuels while we're also providing supports for electrification of both the light duty market, which is the passenger cars and trucks, as well as the medium and heavy duty market for buses and trucks to move along in that way. We need to have accelerated ZEV adoption. We need to have early retirement of internal combustion vehicles, which will be very challenging and expensive. So we need to find ways to provide incentives for making these changes in both the business community and from state leadership. So certainly, we have a lot of challenges with how we're going to achieve some of the objectives that are laid out in the plan, because we want to make sure that we are being practical about this while we're pushing for this transition to much cleaner vehicles that are causing significant sources of air pollution beyond just greenhouse gas emissions. I think almost more importantly, in the more immediate term, is we need to be reducing the amount of air pollution from particulate matter, from benzene, from NOx that are occurring from using the fossil fuels that are out there. So we really need to get much more legislation out there to support an investment in electric vehicles, recognizing the role of these various fuels that can help us move along, things that are going to incentivize people to use mass transit and using micromobility. And so those are some of the items that are included in here. Because by 2050, we need to really shift entirely to ZEVs. That's not really an option. We really need to have all of our vehicles be moving to zero emissions by that time, and use these low carbon modes of transportation, and making sure that most of the light duty and majority of the medium and heavy duty vehicles are in fact ZEVs by that time. We will not be able to achieve our goals without having a massive transition in the transportation sector. So we know that there are a lot of different investments that the state is making. For example, the Bond Act includes $500 million for electric school buses that will be on the ballot this November. We have other funding programs that exist to provide support. We all would like to see Build Back Better get done and provide an extension and expansion of the tax credit for buying electric vehicles. We've made major investments in mass transit from the infrastructure bill, the largest investment in mass transit ever, and MTA is the largest beneficiary of that. We need to make sure that we have more public and private collaboration and broad industry actions to get the investments that we need, both from the state government, from the federal government, from the local governments, as well as with industry to make these moves to these cleaner transportation sectors. And we need to have these early actions and investments here and now in the 2020s to ensure that we have the availability and affordability of these future fuels and the technologies, and fuels in this case includes electricity and green hydrogen that can help us to decarbonize our transportation sector. We know that this will, as I mentioned, result in much lower greenhouse gas emissions, but there will also be significant air quality improvements. Raya mentioned in her presentation that a lot of the attributes of savings are in health benefits, and a lot of those health impacts come from the low level combustion that's happening from internal combustion engines of vehicles. So there will be a significant improvement in air quality that can support improved public health. We have this real opportunity to be a leader on transportation electrification and pave the way for other states. We're a bit behind California, where they have much worse air quality, but certainly we have a chance to be a real leader in this area and to support much greater investment in electric vehicles and charging infrastructure, and having more collaboration between the state and our local governments to help make sure that this comes to fruition. Locally in Westchester, you're going to obviously have improved, communities, better health, increased accessibility of electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. We would expect that there would be significant improvements and investments in the Metro North, in Amtrak. We already know that the B line is committing to move to electric buses, which is a real opportunity to help improve the air quality locally. And we appreciate the leadership that the county is showing in that regard. Moving to all electric school buses, White Plains has been doing a pilot at looking at how school buses can be used, for example, to support energy storage that we talked about with our buildings and the electric sector. And that's a real opportunity. And we know that Bedford has started passing legislation or adopting school budgets that include purchasing of electric buses. So moving to electric school buses is something that you're starting to see now. And that is something that you all can do, is to help encourage your school districts to start looking into purchasing electric school buses. We know that there will be more safer cycling and walking, and connecting with, having more development that's connecting with Metro North stations, and sort of supporting more dense and walkable downtowns. So those are things that you can expect to see locally associated with moving us towards a clean transportation system. So a number of things are recommended in the plan that will help us to reach the goals of getting all these electric vehicles out there and of decarbonizing our transportation sector. And that's, including adoption of a clean fuel standard to reduce transportation emissions, investing in programs that accelerate the deployment of EV charging infrastructure, helping to bring down the cost of purchasing new and used electric vehicles. And there will be a market coming in the very near future for used EVs as people start moving out of leases. Having more ZEV sales requirements, will also mean making more ZEVs available for sale, promoting, clean and safe micromobility practices, which is bikes and e-bikes and scooters, with building more protected bike lanes to make it safer for people to use these alternative modes of transportations, because we need all these modes to be part of the solution. We need more investment and greater investment, as I mentioned, in public transportation, including better designed bus bus routes and making sure that we are reevaluating those periodically to make sure that we're not just running the same bus routes over and over again, but looking at where people are living and working so that there's better connections. We need to make sure that they're all moving to zero emissions. There have been some questions about costs on that front because electric buses do cost more money, although there is savings over time. And so there are opportunities, but there needs to be a rethinking of how some of the transit systems think about their money, capital dollars versus they get savings in operations, because having an electric bus doesn't require as much maintenance, and making sure that there's worker training associated with how those vehicles are maintained and used is very important. Of course, the state has and will continue to make sure that our trucks are getting cleaner. We join with California very frequently to make that happen. Because they have under federal Clean Air Act, they have the ability to go further than the states can do separately other than California. And so we work with them. The state has already adopted what's called the Clean Trucks Rule that would require the Advanced Clean Truck Rule that requires emissions reductions from medium and heavy duty vehicles. And so we will continue to press with California to help move things forward on that front. We want people to use mass transit and micromobility, but clearly for people who need cars and in many of the suburban communities like Westchester and Long Island and upstate New York, even more so, we need people to go into electric vehicles. We've been working on a public awareness campaign about the benefits of electric vehicles, and we've been encouraging people to use them. New York has programs like the Drive Clean rebate, but we really, for us to get to 1 million vehicles by 2025, which is currently the state's immediate goal, we are way behind. As I mentioned, we have about 45,000 registered EVs on the road today. That is definitely ramping up here in 2022. As anyone who's tried to buy an EV can tell you, there's a wait to go get some, but there is certainly a long way to go in order for us to reach that. So we have a lot of work to get our vehicles moving forward. We saw during the pandemic how much pollution cars cost, because when no one was driving, air pollution in New York City went down 25%. That was pretty stunning to see, so immediate of an action. And we've been trying to get more people thinking about the use of their street space and prioritizing pedestrians and cyclists over cars, because very often on streetscapes, cars spend a lot of time parked and doing nothing and not providing a whole lot of value there. So certainly that's something that we're looking forward to seeing more of, people sort of reclaiming their streets, similar to what Paris is doing right now. And of course, we've already adopted some laws, beyond the e-bikes and e-scooters. The state has adopted a law just this year that requires all school buses to be electric by 2035, which is fantastic. We passed congestion pricing in 2018. It feels like forever ago right now. 2019, and that is something that will result in more improvements in the mass transit system, including 10% of those funds need to be spent for Metro North, so that we're making sure that we're improving the railway system to give people alternatives to taking a car to drive into Manhattan. So that is something that we're really excited about. So there's a lot of things, there's more to do on the transportation sector, but we have other things to talk about. So I'm hoping we educated you a little bit about some of the things that are in the plan and what we need to do to decarbonize the transportation sector. And our next speaker is going to be Karen Mira, who is a partner in the environmental and land use practice at Carter, Ledyard and Milburn, to speak about land use. Karen.
Let's see. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I'm going to try to share my screen. Hang on a second. As several of the speakers have already said, many of the sectors addressed in the climate in the draft scoping plan are intersecting. Everything is interrelated. As Julie just mentioned, transportation, whether we are able to reduce emissions from transportation will be the result not only of electrifying vehicles, but also attempting to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about today. I am having trouble figuring out okay, here we go. Before we dive into the details, I wanted to, as other speakers have conveyed to you what the climate, what the CLCP, what the Climate Act's requirements are in terms of their sector. Like, for example, 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. I thought we should start out by looking at what does the act require in terms of land use? What was the council's charge in preparing this draft scoping plan? So they basically said that the draft scoping plan had to, at a minimum, include land use and transportation planning measures that aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles. One point I want to make about that is they could have been more expansive in that statement. They could have said land use aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, right? Land use affects not only transportation, it also affects, the denser development sometimes results in lower emissions because of the shape of buildings, whether they're single family, attached, apartment buildings. Anyway, so I just wanted to flag that as something that was, this is a floor for the council to consider in what they want to get out of the land use provisions in the scoping plan. They're also required to think about land use in terms of carbon sequestration, looking at forestry, looking at land use, agriculture, and other natural areas like wetlands for offsets. I think an earlier speaker talked about the 2050 goals. We're hoping to get to net zero, both by reducing carbon emissions and offsetting those that we can't achieve through reductions. So, and then of course, as many speakers have discussed, all of this is we are trying to maximize reductions while also removing greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities. Okay. So what's the state of the sector? How are we doing on land use? New York State actually has a lot of forest land. So in terms of offsets, we have apparently 63% of the state is covered with forest land at 18.6 million acres, and that holds a lot of carbon in. And there are a number of existing state programs designed to preserve forests, to purchase forests, to have conservation easements on forest land, to provide incentives for private owners not to cut down their forests. Transportation, I'm sorry, I've lost my place. So it also, we already talked about that land use cuts across transportation. One thing that's not really focused on a great deal in the land use section is that land use cuts across building emissions. If you have denser building forms, that can reduce emissions from buildings. If they only have, if they're attached on two sides, they don't lose as much heat. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to say about this section before I dive into some of the details of the proposals is that unlike energy policy, which is, of course, almost everything that happens in New York State goes through the Public Service Commission, and there are very set targets in the Climate Act as to how much the reductions in emissions we are striving for in 2040 and in 2050. Here, there are no specific goals for the land use section. The goal is to try to encourage basically smart growth, transit-oriented development, preservation of natural lands that serve as carbon sinks. And one of the most important things I thought came out of this section is they encourage communities to identify, whether it's regional, county, town or statewide to try to think about what areas do we want to preserve in our best design to be preserved for carbon sequestration, whether it's forests, wetlands, agricultural land, and which areas are best for denser development, for the kind of development that could reduce the vehicle miles traveled and that could reduce the building emissions. So what kind of programs does New York already have in these areas? One program that that New York has is the Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act. And that act requires state agencies, before they invest in a major infrastructure project, to consider a number of criteria that are, criteria related to smart growth principles before they move forward with the program. They have to decide, is this advancing those goals? Is this not advancing those goals? But as the scoping plan points out, it's an advisory program, and it only applies to state agencies carrying out infrastructure programs. Other programs are, there's a number of funding programs like the Downtown Revitalization Initiative, where the regional planning councils all across the state every year receive applications from municipalities that want to revitalize their downtown areas, and they can get funding from the state up to $10 million per municipality for investments in things like parks, bike lanes, multifamily housing, public performance spaces, and things like that. And the picture there, I believe, is from Peekskill, one a couple of years ago. And that's an affordable housing development that will be receiving some subsidy as part of that DRI, Downtown Revitalization Initiative. And then on the forest side, the state has long been involved in both direct land acquisition and has a conservation easement program to protect natural lands for their not only their carbon sequestration values, but air purifying and heat cooling effects and other ecological benefits. Okay. So what did you'll notice that I took off the 2030 because there is no mention in the scoping plan of a set of 2030 goals and a set of 2050 goals. There's just a series of recommendations. And, they kind of fall into two categories. One is very specific to land use at the community level in terms of zoning and transportation and where you're going to put renewable energy siting. And then the other set involves preserving natural land. So I'm going to spend most of my time on the smart growth and transit-oriented development. I included on this slide, if you just want to, I won't bore you by reading through it, but I thought it was important to understand what we mean by those two terms, because they're all throughout the scoping plan, and this is how the council defines them. And I would say transit-oriented development is a subset of smart growth. It's basically, growth intended to be more compact, mixed use, mixed income, walkable, bikeable, and to sort of create the density that you need to support transit, to make it possible for people to get the things they need without getting in their car and driving several miles away. So the last bullet here, there is the scoping plan talks a lot about that, municipalities are responsible for zoning largely in New York State. I mean, obviously the state has a role in things in many aspects of what happens all across the state. But, when it comes to what kind of uses and building forms are we going to put in this location? Where are we going to preserve parkland? Where are we going to build local roads? That is all often determined at the municipal level, and the scoping plan acknowledges that and does not suggest any changes to that. And the reason I mention that is there was, when the governor gave her State of the State speech, there were a couple of proposals that would have changed certain land use provisions in state law and limited localities, tied localities' hands as to those. One was TOD, one was accessory dwelling units, and there was quite a bit of strong reaction to that. And at the moment, she's no longer advancing that. But I wanted to point that out because, we're talking about what's in the scoping plan. I think it's also important to talk about what's not in the scoping plan. And I am representing myself and not, here to make any recommendations about what people should or shouldn't be saying in their comments to the council. But I just wanted to note that could have been in there and isn't. Okay, so what are some of the specific recommendations for local planning and land use? Basically, there are a lot of incentives. There are a lot of technical assistance, a lot of support to localities. I think the state, has the council understands that land use is going to happen at the local level, but every locality does not have the resources or the expertise to figure out how do we plan for future growth? How do we change the way we plan for our community in a way that's going to be sustainable, equitable, create concentrations around transit so we can have a walkable community with less people reliant on vehicles. And so you'll see the list of items here, and this is just a very small subset. There were many, many, many recommendations. For example, there already exists a smart growth comprehensive planning grant. I think many of you may be familiar with the concept of comprehensive plans. Towns, villages can adopt a comprehensive plan, and then development going forward needs to be consistent with that plan. And so, the state is offers grants to help communities go through that process and technical assistance. Many of the proposals in the scoping plan recommend increasing funding and tying it to taking a smart growth lens. Like, so for example, a community that wants to try to make the center of their community a little bit more denser, a little more mixed use, a little more transit friendly, is going to be eligible for more funding than one that's taking a more car oriented approach. And again, technical assistance is very big. They propose that technical assistance should be provided to regional and county planning. I think there's also one of these talks about technical assistance to localities. They propose to create model laws for smart growth, which would be huge assistance to municipalities since they can't all, they're not all in a position to draft laws from scratch, and those would be aligned with sustainability and smart growth goals as well as equity goals under the Climate Act. And yes, and all of these would need to be designed to ensure equitable development and avoid displacement. And they would also include things like model outreach materials. Another proposal is to encourage and support site repurposing, such as fossil fuel plants that are going out, brownfields. There's proposed technical assistance to identify locations for renewable energy projects, and and assistance for getting through the environmental review process for those projects. Another thing that came up a lot in this section is the fact that there isn't a lot of baseline data. Like we have a lot of data on how much electricity we use, how much emissions comes from the vehicle sector. There's not a lot of data on how much emissions come from specific communities, and so it's hard to know how much any one of these particular proposal that a community might pursue is going to impact emissions overall. And so one of the proposals is for the state to provide, sort of a clearinghouse of data on that could be useful for planning, that, whether it's, modeling vehicle miles traveled if you develop this way or that way. So there's that. And then the biggest thing, I would say the biggest mechanism in the recommendations to sort of try to encourage change is to align state funding programs with these goals. And not just, the smart growth grant program, but for example, affordable housing programs. There's the low-income housing tax credit. If you create, there's a suggestion that you would make that tax credit, that any solicitations for new affordable housing using that tax credit would have to meet certain TOD, transit-oriented development goals, or would be viewed favorably in the review process. Let's see. Another one of the more specific recommendations was requiring any community with a commuter rail station has to have a transit-oriented development plan, or they cannot get grants under that plan. And whoops, sorry, my apologies. I went right past. I had meant to start my timer and I forgot. So if somebody could tell me how I'm doing on time, I will hurry up.
Oh, I think you have about 30 seconds to wrap up.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, it's not your fault. I forgot to turn on my timer. One of the very specific recommendations they made is to change. There's currently a smart growth law, and that's the one that I mentioned before. That's for infrastructure projects that state agencies have to use. There's a suggestion that be revised to make the criteria align better with the goals of the Climate Act. And there's also some suggestion, although it wasn't very specific, that it'd be less advisory and more binding. And it apply to not just infrastructure projects, but any project where an applicant is trying to get state funding or state approval. So I obviously did not, I spent too much time on all of the smart growth stuff, but there's a whole lot of stuff in the scoping plan about forestry and trying to make sure lands that act as carbon sinks are preserved and expanded. And I know I'm out of time, but let me just make one point on this. One of the very specific proposals in this section was to, anytime a developer is going to be cutting down trees for part of development, the developer would have to purchase and set aside forest land as a carbon offset. And that's somewhat comparable to what currently exists for wetlands. There's often when developers are filling in a wetland in one place, they have to compensate by identifying and preserving often more a greater area of wetland in a nearby area. And so that would be a big change. Anyway, I basically, I can't tell you what the world will look like, as opposed to being able to say we'll have 1 million vehicles a year, 15 years from now. I don't know how these recommendations will translate into reality, especially because, as I said at the end, there's few sticks and many carrots. And so some localities will pursue them and some won't, and it'll depend how much funding there is. But, there's certainly, I think the alignment of funding to localities with trying to meet many of these smart growth goals will certainly have some impact.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. So there are a few more slides that Karen hasn't had the opportunity to get through.
That's okay.
But
Don't
we'll
worry.
make sure that everyone sort of has that in their
Don't worry.
leave behinds. So,
Yep.
I'm going to take this back to Julie.
Yep. So thank you so much, Karen. There's a lot of interesting things happening in the land use area. More to come. I will just make another plug that there's also funding in the Bond Act for open space preservation. Next, we are going to hear, and last, this is our last speaker. We are going to hear from Risa Domino, who is a managing principal with RRS, which is a sustainability and materials management consulting firm, and a partner at Signal Fire Group, a subsidiary of RRS, which is focused on supporting governments and businesses navigate policy and regulation to move towards circular economy. And I can tell you from my own experience working with her when we were both at the State Department of Environmental Conservation, that she helped develop the state's last solid waste management plan. So she is certainly an expert in this area. So Risa.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate y'all inviting me here to talk about waste today. As those of you who know me know, there's nothing more I like to do than talk about trash. I was really pleased to be part of the waste advisory panel and help develop some of the recommendations I'll be talking about today. So just to start on the state of the sector, sadly, 30 years after recycling became a requirement, a mandatory requirement in New York, we're still landfilling most of the materials that we generate here in the state. And whether we're doing that within the boundaries of the state or to landfills in other states through export, we combust a small amount and we're only recycling about 18% of the materials we generate in the state. So we have a long way to go in terms of achieving a real recycling economy here. What does that mean in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? Well, if you look at the greenhouse gas emission inventory that was shared earlier, you'll see that most of the direct emissions related to waste management in the state come from landfills. It's almost 80%, and that's both the waste that's landfilled within our state and our waste that's landfilled out of state. It's largely due to the generation of methane, a very potent greenhouse gas that is generated when organic matter decomposes in an anaerobic environment. So that means your food, your paper that doesn't get recycled, all of those things are generating methane in the landfill. And that's where most of our direct emissions come from. We also have a handful, 15% or so, coming from wastewater treatment plants that are handling our biosolids and sewage treatment. So there's leaks there, there's process system emissions and things like that. A small amount comes from combusting or incinerating waste in the state, about 7%. But it's important when we think about the impact of waste on greenhouse gases that we look more broadly. Because if you look at the emissions a different way, and you look at how much of the inventory is related to the national greenhouse gas inventory is related to producing, using, and managing the products and packaging that become waste, it's a more significant factor. So about 42% is estimated by EPA of the overall greenhouse gas inventory is related to the materials that ultimately go to waste. So that means, like, when you extract the virgin materials that you make into a product or a package, the impacts of that, the impact, the energy in production, transportation of those materials, et cetera. So when we look at how to address the emissions related to waste, it's important to look at recovering those materials, both to get them out of the landfill so they're not generating methane, and also to get them back into new products so we're producing less greenhouse gas in the production, in the sort of functioning of our economy. So, the real benefits of recycling from a greenhouse gas perspective, particularly if you're talking about things that are not organic. So if you're talking about metals, plastics, glass, the real benefits from a greenhouse gas perspective come when you recycle that material into a new product and you reduce the need to extract and produce virgin materials to use that to make that product. So it's really important that we have functioning, effective local recycling programs, because recycling is essentially a supply chain that begins in your kitchen or your bathroom or where you're generating recycled materials. So we need an effective system that'll help you divert those materials and help get them back into production. It's also important to remember that organic materials, particularly food waste and other organics, are significant contributors to the methane emissions from landfills. So looking at things like food redistribution and composting of food waste instead of landfilling is really important in terms of mitigating those impacts. And the use of compost provides other greenhouse gas benefits like carbon sequestration. So I also don't have these recommendations broken out by 2030 and 2050 because the waste sector doesn't really work that way. If we want to, the materials that we're putting in landfills today will continue to break down and generate methane for the next 30 years or so. So we need to really take these actions immediately in order to meet the 2050 goals to get those materials out of the landfill. The landfill emissions we have today are based on things that we disposed of decades ago. So it's important that all of these actions are taken as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So when you look at the recommendations in the scoping document, you see a variety of recommendations around waste reduction. I'll highlight a few of the most important concepts here. One is focusing on organic waste, as mentioned. Food in particular and organic materials more generally are significant contributors to methane production, which is the biggest direct greenhouse gas emission related to our waste management. So we need to deal with that. Increasing food rescue is important. So let's get usable, edible food to people who can use it and eat it. And then let's make sure that the food that is no longer usable is recycled, composted, and beneficially used. Ultimately, we want to move to a ban on disposal of organics. So ultimately, we want to see no organic materials going to landfill. This is the policy in Europe, where you are not allowed to landfill unprocessed organic waste. Moving in that direction would be important. We did have a food waste law that passed and then that is now being implemented that directs large food generators to compost and redistribute usable food. And so we need to expand that approach over time to smaller and smaller facilities until we have broad scale access to composting and food redistribution. As we look at materials use reduction, reuse, and recycling, we need to look at policies that increase reuse and phase out the use of single-use products and packaging. So increasing reuse refill and reducing reliance on single-use plastic packaging. We need to look at different ways that we can do outreach, education, and support municipal programs. As I said, the success of recycling relies on decisions that we all make in our homes. So reaching people about how to participate, where to participate, why to participate is really important piece of making the system work. And then we also need to look at sectors that provide high potential benefit. Textiles, for example, with the rise of fast fashion, there's a lot of textile material in the waste stream. It's growing, limited opportunities to reuse and recycle that. We need to really build that infrastructure. One of the important policy tools for improving the recycling infrastructure and really reducing the greenhouse gas emissions there is extended producer responsibility for packaging and for products. Extended producer responsibility is a policy approach that requires the producer of a product or a package to take responsibility for that product or package at the end of their useful life. So that may be a financial responsibility. They have to pay for recycling or management of that material. It may be operational. They may have to actually take that material back, or some combination of the two. We use EPR currently in New York to manage things like electronics, rechargeable batteries, mercury thermostats, as of the beginning of this month, paint. So it's a tool that we've used pretty broadly in New York, and we need to expand it, particularly to things that have a large climate impact. I'm very pleased to report that the legislature has passed EPR for carpet, which while carpet is not a big methane generator in the landfill, it is one of offers one of the greatest opportunities for reduction of greenhouse gases in recycling, because there's a lot of embedded energy in a carpet. And so recycling that material has a terrific greenhouse gas benefit. So pleased to report that that's passed the legislature, is going to be hopefully signed by the governor soon. And also EPR for packaging and paper products. I will adjust the slide here. It's really important, as I mentioned, one of the key organic components in the landfill is paper. So we need to make sure that any EPR for packaging also includes paper packaging and other paper products, like magazines, flyers, junk mails, and things of that nature. Refrigerants have a very significant greenhouse gas impact. And so programs that ensure appropriate management and diversion of refrigerants are key, and that's addressed in the recommendations as well. And then lastly, looking at the wastewater treatment sector, what the plan suggests is that we should be converting, instead of thinking about wastewater treatment, we should be thinking about water resource recovery facilities. So let's approach these facilities looking at maximizing the recovery of biogas and maximizing the composting and beneficial use of the biosolids. So I mentioned that we're now seeing the emissions of things that we put in the landfill over the last couple of decades. So it's really important that while we're making these decisions that really plug the pipe and stop sending materials to landfill, we are looking at addressing leaky landfills and fugitive emissions. I saw somebody ask the question earlier about fugitive emissions. Those are essentially leaks. It's emissions that aren't intended or aren't intentional. And so we need to really look at ways that we can mitigate the leaking of greenhouse gases out of landfills and out of these wastewater treatment plants or water resource recovery facilities. When we think about waste in a truck, the material that's being dumped in that picture, there's methane already being generated and released as that material is left in the landfill. So we need to update our regulations and our requirements to better handle that material that comes in, better capture that gas on an operating basis, and better cap the landfills and manage that material moving forward. So we also need to do better monitoring, both in landfills and on the wastewater front. We don't have good monitoring in place. We don't have good emissions data. So we really need to make sure we're carefully monitoring what these emissions are and addressing those leaks immediately. One of the important things to think about here too is, as was said earlier about other greenhouse gas emissions, the methane that leaks from landfills also carries all sorts of other toxic and hazardous emissions with it. So addressing this not only addresses greenhouse gases, but also improves the quality of life in communities, reduces the other toxic emissions and things like that. So it's all around good practice from a community standpoint and from an environmental standpoint. So what are the statewide implications here? Essentially, focusing on waste reduction, reuse, and recycling provides benefits both economically and environmentally. As you can see on the right here, because of that long lag period in decomposition of material, we need to take actions immediately. We won't see landfill gas reductions for a ways down the road. Still important that we act immediately, otherwise that just gets pushed out even further. But so, as I mentioned, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from landfills and wastewater treatment plants improves the quality of life in surrounding communities, addressing some of those issues we've been talking about earlier in the presentation, reduces odors, and reduces public health impacts. If you look at EPR and other recycling programs, not only one of the great benefits of EPR is that it provides financing for recycling, and so it reduces the cost to local governments and to ratepayers for handling these materials. So we get some cost savings there. And we also get some business opportunities in place. So, for example, the carpet recycling bill that just passed, there are a host of companies that are ready to come in and set up shop in New York, set up new facilities, hire local people, 600 to 1,000 people. We estimate will be employed in the carpet recycling network statewide. So really great benefits economically as well as environmentally. And we all, as residents of the state, will benefit from access to better programs, from the ability to reuse and recycle materials moving forward. In terms of what that looks like in Westchester, less waste means a nicer community. You have, if we're able to really finance and develop food redistribution, that really helps serve community needs. Helps meet the needs of residents. If you're able to recycle and compost those organics and recirculate them, there are community benefits to that as well. Increasing availability of different recycling programs, reuse and refill options, the opportunity to recycle, maybe not just in your home. Westchester has a great residential recycling program, but also on the go in public spaces, at work, and things of that nature. I talked about jobs and entrepreneurial opportunity, and then reduced odors and improved public health impacts. So what are the action steps here? There are legislative and regulatory actions and investment required for all of the actions recommended in the plan, whether it's reducing disposal of organics by investing in food redistribution and organics infrastructure, or putting policy in place to ban disposal of organics. Extended producer responsibility, again, is a great tool because it provides both that investment by bringing producer funding to the table, and also that policy that ensures strong available recycling programs. Fugitive emissions really require regulatory action and oversight on the part of the agency. And then robust waste prevention, reuse, and recycling programs require both policy and investment on the government level. So hopefully I got through that quickly enough. And again, appreciate everyone's attention and inviting me to talk about this today.
Thank you so much. We are very appreciative. So everybody, it is almost 2 o'clock, and I wanted to just come back on and say that while we had our expectation was that what we would be able to do is go through a robust Q&A, it seems as though we won't be able to get through that, but we see that everyone has in fact put their questions in the chat, and we have all of those answered in a Google Doc, and we'll be sharing the answers with those answers to those with you all on Friday when we send you a copy of the presentations along with a recording. But the most important thing that we're going to be sharing with you in an email on Friday is what we're calling a comments guide. The goal here today was to help summarize the scoping plan, the draft of the scoping plan, and also help maybe point out the top recommendations and the rise to the top implications. So this comment guide will in fact be something that you can use in what we hope you all do after this is take the time to submit public comments. The public comment period ends on June 10th. So the goal here is to have something that's easier for you to do that. Some of it might be copy and paste. Some of it might be reminders of what you learned here today. There'll also be a sort of best practices on how to draft your comments and get the maximum benefit of the 2,000 character count that is apparently the requirement. So all of that is coming your way. I want to thank everyone here who spent their lunch hour and then some with us. So we're very appreciative of that. We are here to answer questions. So if you had other questions that you did not get to put into the chat and you want to contact any of the presenters, certainly feel free to reach out to Sustainable Westchester or the LCV, and we can help facilitate that for you. A big thank you again to all of our presenters. So much information, so much good information, a lot to get through. So we appreciate your doing it all and doing as much as you can in the 15 minutes. I personally want to thank Nia Rhodes Jackson and Caroline Hahn from the LCV and Claire Kokoska from Sustainable Westchester for all of us worked to put this on today, and we could not have gotten through it without each other. And I should certainly say I could not have gotten through this day without them. So this has been great. If anyone wants to make any last minute comments, we have just about 5 minutes left. So if there's anyone who wanted to jump on and say anything, that's tremendous. I do know that I could only see the chat going by in this small little box, but I saw so many of you were so graciously answering questions back and forth in the chat. So that's a tremendous help. And thank you all for your knowledge, whether you were a presenter or an attendee today. I saw that many of you were jumping on. So that's just great stuff. Anything else? LCV, anyone, Nina, Julie, Nia, or anyone would like to say anything?
I think thank you for your partnership with the Sustainable Westchester. We're very grateful to that. And thank you to everyone who joined, because we know it's really important for people to be engaged on these issues and for people to be aware of what's happening and to get information out there. We know it's a very heavy document that the state has put together, because there's a lot to do when you're working on an economy-wide plan that's looking at what we're going to be doing for the next 30 plus years. So we hope that this was very helpful to you in thinking about this, and we encourage you to continue to participate in civic engagement. And I will always and everywhere tell everyone to make sure you get out and vote. That's the most important thing you can do if you want to act on climate, is make sure you're electing leaders who are prioritizing the environment. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you again to LCV for your partnership in this as well, and to all of you for investing the time in joining us today to learn about all the different facets of the scoping plan. And thank you so much to our expert presenters for sharing your expertise. And now it will be time to make your voices heard. So we hope we're helping to support you in doing that.
Perfect. All right, everyone, have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy your day.